morning. Good morning, everybody. We are in the middle of one of my favorite little kind of mini units to teach to my 6th grade ancient history students. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about it because I feel like kicking off the year with ancient history is really difficult to do. Like, where do you begin? How do you set the tone for what you're going to be doing in ancient history? For a lot of my students in 6th grade, this is the first time that they really have like dedicated time for history or social studies. They come to my class every single day. They have their textbook. It's its own separate class, and we're really trying to learn historical thinking skills. And to be honest, ancient history is not my forte. I do a lot with like Caribbean history and American history and history of the Harlem Renaissance, but take me back thousands and thousands of years and I'm a little bit disoriented. I'm a historian, so I like dealing with text and like documents, but when we're looking at ancient history, it's mostly archaeology and artifacts. So I have to do a lot of my own learning, and then I have to figure out a way to like distill that for 6th graders. So my son Jensen is obsessed with Moana. We watch that movie constantly. We are big Maui fans. So I've seen that movie like 800 times. And once when I was watching it, I realized that that scene where Moana's grandmother shows her the ships that were like hidden in that cave, I realized that that is such a great way to teach artifacts. So at the beginning of the year, when we're just kind of starting to learn about historical thinking skills and how we do history, I show that section of the movie. So I just bought it on iTunes. I had it anyway because we watch it at our house all the time. But I show the clip where Moana's grandmother leads Moana into the cave. She finds this ship. She kind of like rubs her hand along it. She hits the drum, and all of a sudden, all of the markings and the art and the images and everything on this ship just comes to life, and she's transported back in time and she sees what this artifact was used for. So we watch the whole musical scene where they are sailing on the ocean. We know the way, and then it goes back to Moana and she discovers we were voyagers, and she runs out to her grandma and she says, "Why'd we stop?" And right there is where I cut it. So we watch that scene all together, and I ask my students, what is the artifact that Moana found? And they say, it's this ship. She found these ships that she didn't know were there. And I'm like, yes, okay, so this is the artifact that she finds. And if only this is always how it worked, right? If only every time you found an artifact, you just like touched it, banged a drum, and then all of a sudden it would transport you back into this other world, transport you back in time to when this artifact was used, with a Lin-Manuel Miranda song, no less. They know that I'm obsessed with Lin-Manuel Miranda. I think I have, there he is right there. I have another picture of him over there. So of course we were like, and Lin-Manuel Miranda is singing on this song. But in a way, that's what artifacts do. They can transport us back in time and show us what life was like for these people, whoever, you know, made this artifact. So I have this lesson on Teachers Pay Teachers, and then I have my students do it. I just fold it down the top so you can't see the students' names, but it looks like this. I have some explanation of how to do the lesson, and then I pair my students up so they just get one piece of paper for 2 people, and we watch the scene again, and we are looking for these things. So it says, after her grandmother shows her a hidden artifact, and we define the word artifact, what does Moana learn about her peoples? And we define also, just kind of briefly, all of these things. So what does she learn about her people's culture? And they always say, like, what do you mean by culture? And for our purposes, you know, just at the very beginning of the year, I'm like, you can just look for like clothing and music. Those are usually like very visible aspects of culture. So they're looking for that when we watch the scene again. Geography. Clearly, this tells us a lot about their geography. They lived on islands and then sailed on the ocean. Travel is the next one, and it's definitely gonna tell us a lot about travel. Language. And they're a little confused by this because they know that the song is in like another language, but we just say that, okay, so they have this spoken language and possibly kind of a written language. We see that there are markings like on the boat. So with any artifact, that's what we're looking for. Like, is there written communication here? What are we seeing? Art, we can definitely see art on the boat, and we see that there are a lot of patterns, and they tend to reflect nature, like they reflect the sun and waves. A lot of it is like triangles and shapes, so we look at those things. Challenges, we see that there are storms and rain. Accomplishments is the next one, and so we see that they are sailing on the ocean and they are finding new places. And then, you know, they talk about how, you know, well, they must have built these boats. In every period, you know, they kind of come up with a little bit different answers. The next one is social structure. And I tell them, look for like who is doing work, who seems to have power. And if you watch that scene closely, you see that on the boats, there are men, women, children. They all seem to be equal. They're all helping out with the work. It does seem like there's a man who is in charge, and there's a scene where one man like takes off something that looks like a lei, and then he puts it on the next person. So, you know, it looks like there is some kind of a power structure, and there's a leader, but we don't see a lot of like inequity. And then the last thing is their future. And this is hard to predict, right? But you know, maybe in their future they find new islands. So there aren't really right answers for this, and it, you know, it's not a perfect like analogy, because this artifact is not necessarily real. This is just from the movie, but it's just practice in looking at an artifact and learning about a people's history through that artifact, because that's exactly what Moana does in this scene of the movie. So the next question in it is, what does Moana conclude after studying this artifact? And we all say it together: we were voyagers. She didn't know this about her people. She learned something about her ancestors and what they accomplished and the things that they used to do. And the next question is, what is the effect on Moana after she learns more about her people? And these responses vary, because some people say like, okay, well, she's very excited that they were voyagers, and this is something that like she already feels within herself. And then some kids have seen the movie, some kids haven't. And so the ones who have seen the movie, they say like this inspires her to take action, and she wants to voyage also and go look for, you know, more fish and more food for her people. And then I thought it was interesting too, I heard a group of girls saying, well, she was disappointed because then she goes to her grandmother and she says, why'd we stop? And so I think all of those reactions that Moana had are reactions that we have when we study history and when we learn something about especially our own people's history or our own country's history. Sometimes it's really exciting to learn, you know, maybe that somebody in your family's history like accomplished something really cool. And sometimes it really does like spur us on to action, like, oh wow, my people did this. And you want to like speak that language or do that type of art or whatever it is. And then I think it's also important to recognize that sometimes we're disappointed. Sometimes we haven't lived up to what our history could be. So we talked about this a little bit, how we live in America and we have these incredible founding documents, and when you learn about the Constitution and you learn about the Declaration of Independence, which they'll actually do in 8th grade, we don't do it in my class, but you know, they've heard about it before, they learned a little bit about it in 5th grade. But when we learn about those things, we become excited, we are inspired, and then sometimes that's followed by disappointment. Like, well, we're not necessarily living up to all of those ideals, or throughout our history we didn't always live up to those ideals, but they are amazing ideals and we should. So sometimes that disappointment is necessary after you learn something new and you get excited. So you know, you can take this conversation in like many directions, but it's just a way to kind of have like a visual and a song and just like a reference point that we can go back to as we are learning about artifacts and learning new things about history throughout the year, because ancient history is very tough. You know, there aren't a lot of written records. A lot of it is just through artifacts, and a lot of things we can't know for sure, but they're still really interesting to learn about. So in this Teachers Pay Teachers file thing. I also link a couple of articles on Newsela. So we use Newsela in my district. And so then they go over to an article about how the research behind Moana was actually pretty good. Like the Polynesian people 3,500 years ago did use the stars to navigate. They did have ships. And so this is just another kind of like practice into learning about very ancient people and what they did and what they accomplished and how we know anything that we know about them. So we spent some time, it took like 2 days, like part of one day and then part of the next day, to look at this article on Newsela, and you can adjust the reading level depending on where your students are. They can adjust it for themselves. So we read through that together. We used the 3-2-1 note-taking strategy, where you write down 3 things you learned, 2 important quotes or facts, and then 1 question you have. And we shared out the things that we wrote down and just talked about the article. And then I showed them a map of like Polynesia, where that is. And it took me a while to find a map where like Australia is on one side and then South America is on another side, because usually our maps like aren't oriented that way. So I had to find one that would show that, because it's important to see how many islands are in this Polynesian area and how close they are to Australia and Asia. And then you can see that if you kind of island hop like a lot of these peoples did, you're not too far from South America. So then I kind of changed the subject on them and asked them, how did humans get to the Americas? And most students didn't know, but I asked if they'd heard any theories about that, and a few students had heard of like the Bering Strait. It's a really common theory. We were able to look it up very quickly and see a map, and a lot of historians and archaeologists believe that humans crossed the Bering Strait during the Ice Age from Russia into what is now Alaska. So then I asked them, if we are looking for artifacts, where would we expect to find the oldest artifacts in the Americas? And they thought about it for a minute, and they said, okay, well, in the north, because that's where people first arrived, and then they would start to migrate south, and the newest artifacts would be in the south. That's when I bring in this book. This is called Before Columbus, The Americas of 1491. And there's an adult version of this book as well that you can read to get a little more background information about this. But it's very interesting to learn about the city of Norte Chico in Peru, because this is actually where we find the oldest artifacts and the oldest civilization in the Americas. It's all the way down south in South America in Peru. So we didn't read through much of this today. I think I might add in a little bit of this tomorrow, but this is just like, you know, where you're getting your references. And so then you can show them a map of where Peru is and ask them to come up with another theory about how people may have come there. And they start to realize like, oh, well, Polynesian people were seafaring and they were good at navigation, and they could have traveled to Peru from Polynesia. So now we're just introducing multiple theories, because that's another thing we're going to need to do in a history class, is just know that sometimes we have to question theories that have been around for a long time. And this isn't something I go into with them, but a lot of times our theories are very like Eurocentric. So people were more comfortable with the idea that like Russians moved into North America and that was the first, and maybe less comfortable with or like used to the idea that Polynesians were sailing long before Europeans, and that, you know, South America has these incredibly old civilizations, and they were doing things long before the Egyptians were building the pyramids. So in our ancient history books, it doesn't include the Americas. That's something they do in 7th grade, but you know, that curriculum design was set up a long time ago, where we think of like the Americas as the new world and not as the ancient world. So hopefully someday that will change, because we just want to reflect, you know, what's actually accurate. But here at least we're bringing in these other ideas and acknowledging that early human history is complicated and early civilizations are complicated, and there's more to the story than what we're going to see in our textbook. So we will use our textbook and we will learn about these, you know, traditional civilizations that you learn about, but I do like to kind of just like disrupt it from the beginning and start to plant questions in their minds. Another thing that we talked about too is just like how we knew things about these Polynesian people, because it mentions in the article that we read that they talked to their elders about you know, navigating using the stars. And they talked about how, you know, they believed that there was like a hook, like Maui's hook, that would pull up islands out of the ocean. And so I asked them if they'd seen another Disney short, that I Lava You, or if you just know anything about science and plate tectonics, where, you know, underwater volcanoes continue to erupt, and then it really is like they grow out of the ocean and they pop up out of the water. So we talked about how, you know, these myths that are passed down through people have some truth to them. Like maybe it wasn't actually a god pulling up these islands, but that is kind of what they do. It does seem like they are pulled up out of the ocean, and now we know that that's due to plate tectonics. But looking at legends and myths is one way to get at the truth. We can combine that with archaeology and geology and history, but all of those aspects are important. So I'm continuing to learn more about early human history because it's just not my area of expertise. I've been reading this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, and I've been making some notes, and so this has just been helpful for me with my background knowledge. So I would suggest this book. It's very heavy. I need to finish this soon before I continue teaching. And then another thing that we did today is we watched this video. I can link it below. It's like the history. I was like, today we're just gonna learn like the history of the world really quick. And they're like, okay. So it uses a football field to show like the proportions of how old the earth is, and like when life began, when like single-celled organisms arrived, fish, birds, humans, all of that. So it just gives us a better perspective of like how old the earth is. And like I started the training for the Big History Project. You might have heard of that, but it integrates more science with history, so that we just have like more context for things like early human history. And so, I mean, it's fine, but it's just not really what I want to do. But I have been drawing in a little bit more of that. So like today we looked at the history of the earth, and we did again the 3, 2, 1 notes, and the video is only like 4 minutes long, so it's pretty easy to just show that a couple times so we can kind of wrap our brains around it. Tomorrow we're going to use vocabulary to learn about timelines and just like, you know, CE, BCE, and get a sense of time, because I just feel like all of this really ancient stuff, it's difficult for me to understand, so I want to give my students a good reference point. So that'll be tomorrow. And then there is a lesson on Nearpod that does a pretty good job of explaining the Earth's history as well. So I've actually never done all of this like Earth history stuff with my ancient history classes before, but I do think that it's kind of interesting and a good way to start it off, because if I'm going to cover sapiens and like early humans a little bit better and more accurately than I have before, the science of it matters. So I'm just trying to provide a little bit better context this year. So those are the things that we have done so far. We're only in our second full week. So Moana was great and a really fun reference point. I feel like we should make some kind of an anchor chart based on the kids' responses and put that up just to like reference later. Again, this book is great. Just find like some maps to reference, and then this book also really good. And then vocabulary and Nearpod, I'm always using those, and then the video on YouTube. So I will link all of this stuff below, but yeah, if you're looking for a way to just kind of like kick off the year with ancient history, I like doing it this way. So I need to get some things done. I just want to like sit here and read really and drink my coffee, but yes. I hope this was helpful to you. Leave any questions in the comments down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.